A recent report from the military channel of China's state broadcaster, CCTV, included a line mentioned in passing. A new model of Chinese Air Force fighter jet had flown over the Bashi and Tsushima Straits. While this didn't attract much attention within China, it triggered intense alarm in Japanese and South Korean media. Typically, when Chinese military aircraft approach Japan and South Korea, both countries dispatch their own jets to track and monitor them, using the incidents to heavily promote the China threat narrative. But this time, after China disclosed that the J-20 had crossed the Tsushima Strait, located between Japan and South Korea, neither country issued a corresponding report. This very likely means that the U.S., Japan, and South Korea failed to detect the J-20. It's important to remember that the Tsushima Strait is only 50 kilometers, about 31 miles at its narrowest point, and is blanketed by the dense radar systems of the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. If a J-20 could cross the strait undetected, it implies that in a wartime scenario, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea would be completely unable to stop the J-20's stealthy penetration. The Chinese Air Force's silent breach of America's island chain is just a microcosm of the U.S. China rivalry. In a confrontation unilaterally initiated by the United States, one it originally thought would be an easy exercise in bullying a weaker nation, the roles of offense and defense have been imperceptibly reversed. On Christmas Eve 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The American public was ecstatic, believing their country had won the Cold War and hailing the news as the best Christmas gift. However, when American elites received this news, their reaction was not of pure joy like that of the general public. They knew full well that America, as a hegemonic power, operates on a mechanism of finding and defeating enemies to continually expand its own interests. Without a suitable adversary, America's own system could face serious problems. Elites focused on the U.S. national interest were merely worried about the country's future. Those serving the American military-industrial complex, however, were in an uproar upon hearing of the Soviet collapse. Without the USSR as a peer competitor, how would defense contractors make money? How would the military project its influence? How would politicians who built their careers on hardline anti-Soviet stances advance? In fact, their concerns were far from baseless. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. government, equally burdened by the Cold War, quickly began slashing military spending, forcing many defense contractors to pivot to the civilian sector to survive. To prevent further damage to their interests, the massive American military-industrial complex, which had formed during World War II, grown throughout the Cold War, and become deeply entangled
government to the point of heavily influencing U.S. policy, decisively began pushing for America to find a new enemy. In this search for a manufactured adversary, China, with its different social culture and ideology, was chosen. This was despite the fact that U.S. and Chinese resources were highly complementary, that trade between the two nations had boomed since the normalization of relations, providing a solid economic pillar for the relationship, and that the power gap between China and the U.S. was then enormous. China had also repeatedly swallowed its pride and shown great forbearance toward the U.S. in its efforts to integrate into the American-led international order. But the military-industrial complex, single-mindedly focused on finding an enemy for America to confront, didn't care about reality. They just needed an enemy for the U.S. and a threat to hype up for profit. Looking at the world at that time, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and Eastern Europe had switched sides. To demonstrate the righteousness of America's Cold War victory, there was political pressure to support these new regimes. Ordinary Third World countries were not qualified to be America's rival. If Yugoslavia hadn't descended into chaos, it might have been a good choice, but its civil war had already begun. By process of elimination, only China, while not yet strong, was at least a large country. It was also developing rapidly, showed great potential, and was ideologically opposed to the United States, making it look like the perfect target. Just like that, a faction of politicians emerged in the U.S. Congress who had never been to China, never studied Mandarin, and had no understanding of the country, yet spouted nonstop about the China threat. Under the influence of these politicians, the honeymoon period in U.S. China relations came to an end. The U.S. unilaterally declared China its enemy and constantly sought to provoke it, from the Yinhai incident in 1993 and the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996, to the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia in 1999 and the Hainan Island incident in 2001. The U.S. relentlessly challenged China's sovereignty. It wasn't until the 9/11 attacks that the U.S. found a real existing adversary, shifting its focus to the Middle East. Only then did this one-sided confrontation instigated by the U.S. against China ease somewhat. But it was only a reprieve. The China threat theory remained a hot topic in America. The U.S. remained keen on smearing China in the media, suppressing Chinese companies and business, and conducting frequent military exercises near China as a show of force and a military threat. As for whether this constant prodding at China's red lines would cause resentment and damage U.S.-China relations, the U.S. was originally unconcerned. Although economic cooperation with China made America a lot of money, and cheap industrial goods from China effectively kept U.S.
inflation low, as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, money was never a major issue for the United States. Besides, from the perspective of an America that had long been financialized and held a superstitious belief in the power of the buyer's market, if China wouldn't do low-end manufacturing, plenty of other countries would. It didn't credit China for America's low inflation. If the economic ties between the two countries weren't enough to make the U.S. take notice, China's military strength was even less of a concern. After all, well into the 2000s, China's Air Force still lacked third-generation fighters, and the backbone of its Navy consisted of 4 modern-class destroyers imported from Russia. The Air Force and Navy were no match for America's. Only the Army, thanks to its reputation from the Korean War for holding its ground against overwhelming firepower and driving U.S. forces back to the 38th parallel, commanded some degree of American respect. But with a vast ocean separating the two countries, China's land-based advantage was irrelevant unless the U.S. chose to initiate a full-scale war. Furthermore, after the Gulf War, where air superiority crushed Iraqi morale and the Army secured victory with minimal fighting against the world's third-largest military, the U.S. had come to somewhat devalue the role of ground forces in war. Therefore, although the U.S. actively initiated the topic of a U.S.-China confrontation and cast China as its hypothetical enemy, it showed no signs of taking China seriously as an adversary. While the China threat rhetoric was loud, business with China continued as usual. In fact, due to China's favorable business environment and excellent infrastructure, the U.S. gradually moved its entire industrial supply chain there. At the same time the U.S. was enthusiastically flexing its military muscle around China, it was surprisingly complacent about its own military. After entering the 21st century, America's military modernization nearly stagnated. While the PowerPoint presentations for new equipment were still impressive, the actual products either failed to match the advertising or, in some cases, never left the PowerPoint stage. The U.S. military's maintenance of its existing equipment was also subpar. Equipment readiness rates continued to decline, and even when the Pentagon criticized the situation as unacceptable, the military's response was to diligently admit fault but make no changes whatsoever. China's approach to U.S.-China relations was the polar opposite of America's, which consisted of manufacturing an enemy, posturing aggressively, and preparing passively. On one hand, China consistently emphasized that it adheres to the path of peaceful development, does not engage in great power competition or malicious confrontation, and has no intention of challenging or replacing the United States. It urged the U.S. to stop treating it as a hypothetical enemy. Even when faced with aggressive pressure from the U.S., China always maintained restraint. However, this did not mean China was silently accepting American pressure. Given the power disparity, China simply chose to exercise temporary forbearance to buy more time for national development. Economically, China did not, as the U.S. might have wished, remain stuck
low-end manufacturing. Instead, it seized every opportunity to promote industrial transformation and upgrading, marching toward high-profit, high-tech industries. Militarily, China never slacked off for a moment. The armed forces kept pace with modern military theory, while major defense industrial units kept a close watch on the world's most advanced equipment. Initially, limited by national economic strength and technological reserves, the military and defense sectors had to make do with outdated equipment, even if they had grander ideas. But even in the most difficult times, China never gave up on accumulating military technology reserves. As China's economy grew and the defense sector's funding became more plentiful, these technologies began to be implemented and, supported by China's powerful manufacturing base, quickly moved into mass production. By 2016, even the highly self-regarded United States had taken notice of the rise in China's military strength. In response, it deliberately dispatched 2 carrier strike groups and 1 amphibious assault group to the South China Sea, intending to use a limited hot war to disrupt this process. But faced with China's attitude of being ready to fight to the death, the U.S. ultimately lacked the courage and determination to fight a full-scale war against a major power with long-range nuclear delivery capabilities. It ultimately chose to back down, missing its last chance to overwhelm the Chinese military. After this, China's naval and air forces developed further, taking new leaps in both quantity and quality. In the last couple of years, the U.S. has been reduced to propping up its image of continued global military invincibility by questioning whether China's equipment has been tested in real combat. However, the outbreak of an air battle between India and Pakistan made even this last shred of dignity precarious. Although the Chinese J-20 involved didn't shoot down an advanced American plane, the J-20 is not considered China's most advanced fighter. In contrast, the downed aircraft, a French Rafale, had previously beaten the F-35 in exercises under certain conditions. At this point, the only thing the U.S. military could rely on was the stealth advantage of its fifth-generation fighters. But China's disclosure that the J-20 flew over the Tsushima Strait while the U.S., Japan, and South Korea remained completely unaware proves that when it comes to stealth, China's fifth-generation aircraft are as good as, if not better than, America's. In this U.S.-China confrontation, unilaterally initiated by the United States, the tables have turned. But the nation's inertia makes it difficult for them to end the confrontation, leaving them to play deaf and dumb, pretending nothing has happened.